Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I warmly welcome you all to this seminar titled Climate Finance Needs of 9 G20 Economies, Well Within Reach. Considering the prominence of emerging market economies in global landscape, discourse on their climate finance needs is vital for decarbonizing global carbon emissions. The seminar today will begin with a presentation by Dr. Rakesh Mohan and Dr. Janak. It will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia. The panelists joined here today are Jayant, Sinha, Franziska, and Prodipto, Ghosh. The seminar will close with a Q&A session by the audience. A brief profile of everyone who has joined here today. Montek Singh Ahluwalia is a distinguished fellow at CSEP, an economist and civil servant. He was formerly Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission in Government of India. He has served in the government in various capacities, including Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, and these are just to name a few. For his outstanding contribution to economic policy and public service, he was conferred the prestigious Padma Vibhushan in 2011. Jayant Sinha is the president of Everstone Group and Eversource Capital, and a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. He leads Everstone's efforts to mobilize large-scale sustainability and infrastructure financing. Before joining the Everstone Group, Mr. Jayant served as a two-term member of Parliament and held key positions in the Government of India, including Minister of State for Finance, Minister of State for Civil Aviation, and Chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance. He also serves on the Harvard Business School Global Advisory Board. Franziska is the World Bank Chief Economist for South Asia. She is responsible for leading the research program on key economic issues in South Asia to inform the policy debate and World Bank lending. Her research has covered a wide range of topics in international macroeconomics and finance, including debt and financial crises, inflation and monetary policy, as well as growth and informal labor markets. Prodipto Ghosh is involved in research and teaching at the interface of science, economics, philosophy, and public policy. Currently, he is a distinguished fellow at TERI. He also served as secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change, economic advisor, and additional secretary to the PM, additional secretary at the Department of Economic Affairs, and senior environment specialist at the Asian Development Bank. He was a member of India's negotiating team at UNFCCC climate change negotiations from 2001 to 2012. Rakesh Mohan is President Emeritus and Distinguished Fellow at CSEP. He is also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and the World Bank Group's Economic Advisory Panel. Dr. Mohan was instrumental in formulating India's economic reforms from the late 1980s onwards. His distinguished public service includes positions as Deputy Governor of the RBI, Executive Director on the Board of the IMF, Secretary of Economic Affairs, and Chief Economic Advisor at the Ministry of Finance. Janak is a Senior Fellow and leads the macroeconomic segment in the Growth, Finance, and Development vertical at CSEP. He is currently also a member of the JM Financial Center for Financial Research of IIM Udaipur. He has held several important positions, including Executive Director at RBI, and a member of its statutory Monetary Policy Committee, Senior Advisor to the Executive Director for Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka in the IMF, RBI nominee Director on the Governing Board of BSC, and a Senior Consultant in the Department of Financial Services, Ministry of Finance. And with that, I give it back to Mr. Ahluwalia to proceed the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Actually, I'm supposed to really moderate the discussion, but since I've been asked to ask you to speak, let me do that also. How are you going to do it? You're going to start? Okay, okay. And then you'll say something? Okay, fine.
Yeah, good morning and welcome you all. It's nice to see the house almost packed. So the presentation which I'm going to make is based on the study which we have released just a few days ago. It has three parts. So the focus of this study is on climate finance. I will talk about how many economies we have covered. And apart from assessing climate finance, we'll also talk about the role of MDBs in financing climate action. And then we'll also assess the macro consistency of climate finance which you have estimated. So since the climate finance is about all the numbers. So before we get into the numbers, I would like to give the approach which we have followed. There have been several studies in the global context as well as in the emerging market and developing economies context. And the numbers range widely. For emerging market and developing economies, the numbers range in the from 1 trillion to 4 trillion every year up to 2030. But there were some issues with the numbers which we came across. Most of the numbers have been based on top-down approaches, and they have all followed some models and very sensitive to assumptions you make for getting those numbers. In some cases, we also came across that there was a mix-up of climate finance and development finance needs. And most of the studies have focused only on energy transition, whereby 3 other major sectors about which I am going to talk to you, like cement, steel, and road transport, they have not talked about much. And the last and very important point is about the estimates which they have arrived at. There is no clarity whether the climate finance which all these studies have arrived at are the total climate finance requirements or additional climate finance requirements. This point would be clear to you when we come to the next slide. So the study covers 9 emerging market economies. All are part of G20, 5 of which are BRICS, and apart from BRICS we have Argentina, Indonesia, Turkey, and Mexico. So all these 9 economies, they have a share of 30% in global GDP, 47% in global population, and 30% in global carbon emission. And these 9 economies have a share of the 4 sectors which we are covering, they have a share of 50% of the total carbon emission in the 9 economies. So the sectors I have already mentioned, we are covering power, road transport, cement, and steel. So our estimates are based on additional climate finance required to mitigate CO2. See, when we are investing more in renewable sources of energy or we are investing more in electric vehicles, then we are also saving capex on the traditional sources of energy such as fossil fuel, gas-based or coal-based. So we have made that adjustment. We have not come across any other study which has made that kind of adjustment. And we have followed 2 distinct methodologies. One methodology is for road transport and the power sector, and another methodology is for the cement and steel sector. So since our estimates are based up to 2030, fossil fuel based sources would continue to exist. So there is only partial mitigation of the estimates which you have made. And we have considered all sources of power and all sources of electric vehicle and ICEVs. Like we have taken gas-based, coal-based, solar-based, wind energy, all sources of power we have taken, and we have taken all sorts of vehicles such as 2-wheeler, 3-wheelers, cars, trucks, and buses. And we have also adjusted for the plant load factor. Renewables have much lower plant load factor than the traditional sources of energy such as coal or gas-based. So we have made that kind of adjustment. And we have also considered storage, pumped storage as well as battery storage. But we have not been able to take into account integration cost, or renewables also need to be integrated with the main power system. So that cost we have not been able to work out. And for the road transport, we have also taken into account the cost which is required to be incurred for developing charging infrastructure. So for the cement and steel sector, our estimates are based on full mitigation of CO2. It takes into account all the CO2 which will be emitted by all the existing plants as well as new capacities which will be added up to 2030. Cement and steel are hard to abate sectors because it's highly energy intensive as well as, both the sector highly energy intensive as well as carbon intensive. So there are ways to reduce CO2 in these 2 sectors through energy efficiency or by use of renewable sources of energy or by alternative fuels. But that can be done only to some extent. Our estimates suggest that you can mitigate those emissions only up to 1/3. abating CO2 in these two sectors, you need to apply carbon capture and storage technology. It's basically some sort of facility which is retrofitted on cement and steel plants. Then it captures the CO2, which is then transported either through underground pipelines or through trucks to a distant location where it is injected into geological formation for its whereby it is trapped permanently and it is isolated from the air. So this technology is very expensive as of now, but this is the only feasible technology which can be applied to abate emissions in the cement and steel sectors. There is no other technology. There is another direct air capture, but that technology is much more expensive, but that's still at its infancy. So the period covered of our study is 2022 to 2030. So let me come to the climate finance estimates now. So this is for the power sector. So we have, this covers all the 9 economies, and we find that there is significant change in the different sources of energy in different economies. If you see India, its share of renewables increases from 45% to 63% by 2030. In the case of China also it increases from 55% to 65%. And for South Africa also, a very, very significant increase. Overall, the share of renewable sources of energy in total energy sources increases from 54% to 65%. I may point out that all the economies, they will have share of renewable sources more than 50% by 2030. Indonesia is the only country, I think South Africa and one more country which have share less than, Indonesia, less than 50%.
Janak, can you please explain, is this the base case and is this based on current projections put out by various
these are all based on
agencies?
official projections coming from different countries.
So that's your baseline case?
That's a baseline case.
Okay.
Yeah. So the total estimate which you have made for the power sector works out to only $149 billion US, and of all the countries, China and India have large, I'm saying large only relative to others, but otherwise it's not that large. So India will need $57 billion US for the power sector. Its requirement actually is more than that of China. This is for the reason because India's share of renewable is likely to increase much more than that of China. So how have this number, we have arrived at this number? Let me give you the breakup.
Is this per year or total?
This is total up to 2030.
Okay.
Yeah. So we can see now, this is a very important slide, and that's where the adjustment which I was talking about, whether it's additional climate finance requirement or total climate finance requirement. See, non-fossil fuel based source of power in the 9 economies will require $277 billion US. But all the 9 economies would also be saving $156 billion US on fossil fuel based sources of power. So the net requirement which will be required from transitioning from fossil fuel based sources of power to renewables is $121 billion US, and if you add the storage cost, which is pumped storage as well as battery storage, the total estimates works out to $149 billion US. If you knock out China, then the requirement decreases to $94 billion US.
No, so I just want to make sure I understand your methodology before you move to transportation.
Sure.
You have a baseline case.
Yes, sir.
In that baseline case, for example, in India, you're saying that instead of 45% energy generation from renewables, is that energy or installed capacity?
It's an installed capacity.
So first of all, it has to be energy generation because actually energy generation is 70% right now, not 55%. So you have to look at it in energy generation terms, not installed capacity, but leave that aside. You're saying you're going to go from 45% to 63%, correct? As far as India is concerned.
Yeah.
And you're saying that in doing so, you're going to build up obviously 18% more in non-fossil fuel based, and the cost for that is $277 billion. But you are not installing fossil, and the incremental cost of getting to 63% is the difference between 277 and 156.
Yeah, basically incremental.
Isn't that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
So what you're saying is that the baseline case, or the case that you're saying for India to get to net zero by 2070 is 63%.
No, these are estimates are based only up to 2030, and this is for all the.
No, I know, but see, when we say because I've worked on a lot of these estimates in terms of what is the incremental cost required for us to be on net zero 2070. That's the problem we are trying to solve for, which is if we go to net zero by 2070, how much more are we going to have to spend in power, transportation? So it's a methodological question. That's why I'm trying to.
So this is the government projections for each of these things up to 2030.
Agreed, but is
And
that government?
Assuming that the government projections are for net zero 27, but
Well,
we're not looking at that.
that is precisely the issue.
Yeah.
That's
But we've not looked at that.
So,
That's a
Dr. Mohan,
completely unreasonable assumption. Because I don't think the government projections up to 2030 are in any way related. They have not related.
No, that's what I'm
to
saying.
what
That
is
we have
needed for
only
27.
we have only seen
but
what
Dr.
the
Mohan,
government
so let me
projections
just
are.
build on,
2030.
let me just build on what Dr. Ahluwalia said. The fact is that if you look at any credible projection for India to get to net zero by 2070, we have to pretty much retire all of coal by the late 2040s. Which means that we have to add a lot more non-fossil fuel capacity in the 2030s as well, till 2030, so that we are on a very different trajectory from the baseline case. The incremental cost that we have estimated is for that very different decarbonization trajectory from what the government is modeling. That's why it is an incremental on the baseline case, which is the government's case right now.
Correct.
And in fact, the government has not released a long-term projection, which is how will the 1100 gigawatts, which we'll probably need by 2070, how much energy of that is going to come from various different energy sources. That government projection is not there.
So to be transparent, right, we have just taken for each country, not just India, okay, what their projections are till 2030, right or wrong. That can of course be criticized, as you're saying.
But that's where the rub is.
The
rub is right now is that it is absolutely in the interests of all policymakers right now to not do longer term 2070 projections, because the real trade-offs come there. The real trade-offs come for India for how much of our energy is going to be generated from fossil fuel sources versus non-fossil fuel sources in the 2040s. That's the real trade-off.
No, but we're not going there.
But our estimates are based on 2000 up to 2030, and these are based on official projection. And by the way, when I mentioned that we have adjusted for plant load factor, the total electricity generated is the same based on the projection as well as business as usual, which we have, made the estimate for which we have made.
Right, but what I'm saying is then the 45 to 63% looks a little disingenuous, because what happens then is you're not really showing a transformation, because if I'm generating 70%, 70% is the total amount of energy generated from coal. Even if I go to 63%, we're probably still going to get 60% of our energy from coal, which means the carbon emissions are not going to come down very much. So it's not much of a decarb, and in your critique of the other estimates, their methodology is completely different from your methodology, which is why you can't really compare what you've done to what they've done, because it's not an apples to apples comparison. That's based on a genuine decarbonization trajectory down to 2070. Yours is just based on an incremental assessment of 2030.
That's correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because I've worked on many of those.
No, I know. That's why we wanted you here, because you worked on these things.
But we can't really compare then. When you say that, then your headline, climate finance needs of 9 G20 EMEs well within reach, what are those climate finance? These are not decarbonization by net zero 2070. They are based on the government's projections by 2030. So the headline itself, to me, is not consistent with what many others have been working on.
No,
That's all I'm saying.
actually, let me.
But there are non-official Indian models, including one which Utkarsh is doing for CSEP and CEEW has done, which do address your question.
Yes, of course.
And they would be different from what is coming out
Yes,
India.
But those,
Okay.
No, but it's a methodological
The author has
question.
rightly said we should let them finish. I think we give you
This is very
extra
good.
5 minutes to raise this issue.
No, this is very good.
That's a crucial one.
This
Go
is very
ahead.
good.
No, I just want to mention 4 factors which have contributed to lower that energy transitions estimates. One, there has been sharp decline in solar panel prices. Secondly, there has also been sharp decline in battery prices, and the plant load factor of renewables has also.
Those declines are based on importing from China.
Yeah, but the
Current policy makes that a little open. Will they continue?
But Janak, in the modeling that we've done, all that has been included because there's a cost curve for solar.
Go ahead.
And the fourth factor, of course, is the adjustment which you have
get
made.
a chance to rebut what he says later. Just go ahead and finish the thing.
So this is about the road transport sector, and in the case of India, the share of electric vehicle is expected to increase from 6% to 34%, which is very significant, almost 29% increase. And in the case of Indonesia, it is expected to increase from 1% to 30%. We can see in the case of China, the total number of vehicles in absolute terms are going to decline because the total number of two-wheelers in China, because the government was giving some subsidy which it has withdrawn, as a result of total number of vehicles are declining. And we find that there will not be, we will come to the next slide, there will not be much requirement for transitioning from, internal combustion engine vehicle to electric vehicles, but there will be additional cost for the building charging infrastructure. So the total estimate which you get for all the 9 economies, 459 billion US dollar, of which China alone contributes something like 336 billion US dollar. For India, the amount is very small, something like 18 billion US dollar. And we can see this actually from transitioning from ICEVs to EVs. 9 economies save 5 billion US dollar for the reason I have already explained. In the case of China, there is a decline of vehicles in absolute terms, but China is building fast charging infrastructure, the cost of which is almost 7 times more than that of slow and medium speed charging infrastructure. So if we knock out China, then the total requirement falls down to something like 123 billion US dollar for the 8 other economies. So this is for the steel sector. In case of, I'm talking about India and China here because in the case of China, the steel production is projected to decline by around 11%, whereas in case of India, it is projected to increase by about 80% from 125 million tons to 225 million tons. And the same is reflected in actually carbon emissions. China's share of carbon emission in the steel sector is going to decline to 65.8% from 77% in 2022, whereby India's share of carbon emission from the steel sector is going to increase from 12.7% to 21.9%. So this is the estimate for the steel sector, which is 1.1 trillion US dollar, and the China alone constitutes 733 billion US dollars. In the case of India also, the amount is large, 251 billion US dollar. Actually, in terms of percentage of GDP, India's estimate is the largest, 0.7% for the steel sector. So, as I mentioned, there are different ways to decarbonize the steel sector. So, quite a large chunk of this estimate which you have wrote is emanating from the CCS. That is carbon capture and storage technology. So in the case of steel, in cement sector, actually the decline in the case of cement is much more. Cement production in China is expected to decline by almost 30%, whereby in India is again going to go up by almost 80%. So as a result, the carbon emission from the steel sector in China are expected to decline, whereby in the case of India, they are expected to increase. So this is the estimate for the cement sector, which works out to 453 billion US dollar, and the share of China in terms of absolute amount is 217 billion US dollar. For India, it is 141 billion US dollar. But in terms of, again, as percent of GDP, the India's estimate is the largest of all the 9 economies. So as in the case of steel sector, the largest chunk of climate finance is emanating from the CCS technology. So this is the cumulative, estimate for all the 9 economies up to 2030. So we have right, yeah.
That but between now and 2030, we should be doing CCS in steel and cement.
Yeah.
That's independent of whether the cost in terms of saving would be much lower if we did more elsewhere.
That also will come. We have per unit estimate. So it's basically apart from the numbers which you have given, it's a framework. Even if we may not do up to 2030, we should be able to arrive at it. We don't know whether it will be done up to 2030 or so.
But is that an official projection?
It's based on official projection of steel and cement production, and we have the carbon emission factor through which we have worked out the carbon emissions. So
that you showed that.
That we showed. Yeah.
This is not the official projection of CCS.
So this is based on steel and cement
production. Carbon. Can you show that chart again on the carbon 2.8?
Yeah, that is our that carbon emission factor for the steel is 2.45 or so. It's much higher than the global.
What does it mean, carbon emissions factor?
Like the carbon CO2 emitted per ton of steel.
We are much
production of steel. We are much more than the global average.
Not just all the other countries.
All the other countries. China is also very high, but still slightly lower than the global average. The global average is 1.84 or so. China has 1.8. It's there actually in one of the slides. I can show you that. Yeah, see, this is the for the cement sector. For the cement sector, India has lower carbon intensity for the relating to global average as well as some other countries. But for the steel, we have much higher.
No, so steel, it's absurd.
Yeah. So for steel, we have 2.4, whereas the global average is 1.84, and for China, it is 1.8.
So is there a government projection saying by 2030, this is what the emissions from India's steel sector and cement sector are going to be?
No, so this we have worked out based on the production which have been projected by the government.
In the power sector, you've taken government projections. In cement and steel, you made up your own projections.
No. These are also
we've taken the production government projections, but the mitigation we've done our own.
So you are saying that in those industrial sectors, there should be a decarbonization trajectory that you are developing.
Correct.
But in the power sector, you've taken the government's decarbonization trajectory as well.
We've taken the production is consistent. That we've taken the production projections of the government for both the energy and the steel and cement sectors. The difference is there is no government projection for how much decarbonization should be done in steel and cement.
We have taken only
production
projection, but all estimates we have worked out, like what would the carbon emission as well as climate finance.
I got it. Go ahead.
So this is this slide. So we have total estimate $2.2 trillion US, and it is, if we knock out China, then the total estimates works to only $854 million US. But if we knock out India and China, then the estimates are very small for other 7 economies. So now, with the estimate which you have arrived at, how much we can expect CO2 be emitted or CO2 be mitigated? Unfortunately, we couldn't get the estimate for the road transport sectors, but we have been able to work out for the other 3 sectors. And with the estimate which you have made, we should be able to mitigate 33 billion tons of CO2. The average cost comes to $53 per ton of CO2. The largest cost is for the power sector, which is $66 per ton. For steel, it is 53, and for cement, it is 49, and on an average, is $53 per ton.
Janak,
Yeah.
how have you defined mitigation cost?
Mitigation cost, because the cost which you have estimated. And
You've estimated the incremental investment cost.
Investment cost. And
So
with
this
that, how much we'll be able to, we have carbon emissions.
So it is incremental investment cost per ton of CO2. That's what you define as as mitigation cost?
Yeah, so we have taken all the estimate which you have arrived at. With that estimate, how much we will be able to mitigate CO2?
No, I understand that, because what you've estimated is incremental investment cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So let's be clear about what you're saying.
Ask a clarification question. So you've got different sectors and they've got different marginal costs of abatement. So as an economist, you would say that you should start with that sector where the marginal cost of abatement is the smallest. And you should simply abate in that sector until the marginal cost of abatement is equalized across sectors. That would then give you the least cost weight of hitting a total carbon target for the economy. Is that what you're doing, or is what you're doing, you've got sector-specific targets and regardless of differential marginal costs, you're sort of exploring?
Yep, quite right. No, that's right, because as we're showing the differential cost between the different sectors, so we've not done what you're saying. We've done that's exactly right, because that's exactly what we're showing.
So of the 32 billion tons of CO2 will be emitted, again something like a large chunk of this is coming from India and China. And of course per unit cost of mitigation of power sector is lowest in Indonesia and it's lowest in China, and in China for steel and cement. Yeah. So now we'll briefly talk about multilateral development banks because they have been playing a key role in financing climate action. The total amount which has been disbursed by MDBs, all MDBs, we have taken into account all MDBs, it has increased from $61 billion to 125, almost double in last 4 years. And we have also made projection like how much they could finance. So in 22-23 the actual numbers, so they financed 11.3% of total climate finance requirement, which we have estimated in the 9 economies. And in 2030 that amount is like going to be around 9.1%. If you exclude China, MDBs finance 25%, 26% of the estimated climate finance requirement, and by 2030 it should be around 22%. So now this is the last section. There has been some reports which have suggested that emerging market and developing economies should have large resources from external, large climate finance, large climate finance from external sources. But this slide basically, I will tell you 3 things about this slide. Number 1, a country can easily absorb capital flows or climate finance from external sources to the extent it has current account deficit. And in fact, you need capital flows to finance the current account deficit. Beyond current account deficit, if you are getting capital flows, you can still manage them. You can't absorb into the economy, but you can still manage them to the extent a central bank expand its balance sheet, which is what we call monetary base. It's the liability side of central bank balance sheet, or what we call in India reserve money. So central bank can still manage capital flows up to the expansion of monetary base. Beyond expansion in monetary base, it creates huge monetary and macroeconomic management challenges for any central bank if you continue to get large capital inflows. So this slide tells us that I will give you 3 different scenarios. So first of all, we have estimated what is expected to be total expansion in monetary base in all the 9 economies. It is something like $3.1 trillion, and we have also projected capital flows in the business as usual, which works out to something like $2.8 trillion. So the headroom for these 9 economies is only something like $400 billion to manage capital flows, including climate finance from external sources, up to 2030. As I mentioned, I will talk about 3 countries. Turkey has absolutely no problem because its expansion in monetary base much more than it's expected to get capital flows in the business as usual. In the case of China, China has some room because expansion in monetary base is more than the projected capital flows. But in the case of India, our projections which you have made, capital flows in the business as usual expected to be much more than the expansion in a monetary base. So it will be a challenge for some of the economies to manage both capital flows in the business as usual and climate finance from external sources. So I will end here. These are the basically, I'm not going to repeat them. The power sector number which you arrived at is much lower than of course we will like to hear from our panelists their views, much lower. And in the case of road transport, we have taken into account the charging infrastructure which costs much more than the mere cost of transitioning from ICEVs to EVs. And as I mentioned that capital flows, if you get large, then that would need skillful management, particularly if you get large climate finance flows from external sectors. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Rakesh, would you like to add something, please?
Thank you very much, Janak Raj, for that presentation. And let me just say that this has taken about 2 years of work to get these numbers, because we are familiar with the Indian numbers much more obviously, and it takes much more work to get a handle on the numbers of these other emerging market economies, who unfortunately many of them have different languages also. That's a problem. So we've done the best we can, but it's a sort of ambitious exercise. What I'm going to do is just give some general points of what I think are important in this work. One, of course, COP30 is going on in Belém right now. One of the features of each of the COP meetings has been the very large numbers generated for how much finance is. Of course, there are lots of technical discussions, right, on what needs to be done for climate mitigation. So we're not familiar with that, but there's always a lot of discussion on how much climate finance needed, and those discussions with the kind of numbers that have been generated involve a lot of external finance that needs to come from advanced economies to emerging markets. So one of the things that happens is, Jayant mentioned 2050, 2070. So whereas he is absolutely right that anything you do up to 2030, 35, 40, whatever, should be consistent with whatever path you have to either 2050 net zero or 2070 net zero, as is the case for India. But one of the things that happens, if I can say in my view, is you get numbers that go beyond your head. And in any case, given my age now, I wouldn't be around till 2050, hopefully. So I have very little interest in what happens beyond that. So I'm reasonably sure I'll be around till 2030. Beyond that, I don't know. So I do feel that it's also for practical terms for any country actually, for policy, immediate policy, for private sector also, you really need to concentrate on what do we need to do in the next 5 years, next 10 years, and how much finance we need for those 5 years and 10 years, and then how do we get it? Because otherwise, and also, I'm beginning to kind of get some understanding what $1 billion means. Okay? But trillion, I mean, it's just, don't understand what it means. And so what happens is that when these trillions are given, no one questions them. I was very happy to see various reactions from here, because we've got numbers that you can absorb and digest. So you'll question them much more, which is good. My experience in Planning Commission, by the way, was that you have 5,000 crore project, steel project, or whatever in those days, no one questions it. If you want to, in those days, give 10 lakhs for research project, everyone in the system would come down like a ton of bricks. This is too much. Why are you giving money for this? Why are you giving money for that? It was 5,000 crores. So that's the point that we are making overall, that it is correct that you need to do the path of mitigation to net zero, whichever you want to take, 2050, 2070, etc. But you need, in terms of your projections for the next 5 or 10 years, of course, they ought to be consistent with that. And then they think, what does it look like? And those numbers make much more sense also. So that is one contribution. And second, overall, in terms of approach. Second is to really come to the view that, look, the magnitude is not as large as people have projected. Even if we are wrong in some things, as Jayant has pointed out, even then, even if you double the numbers, they are still the realms of possibility, which then doesn't lead to pessimism that we can't do it. There was one paper that is stuck in my mind from when I used to do courses in central planning in the US, actually. A very well-known paper called Optimal Taughtness of Development Planning by an unknown economist at Haverford College called Holland Hunter. And basically, he was talking about Russian planning, etc. at that time. And they talked about optimal taughtness, that when you plan, you need to plan for something higher than what you can actually do. If you plan for something very much higher, then everything breaks down, actually. And this in the same spirit that we have done this. Two, the external finance numbers also we get are in the realm of realism, and particularly in the context of macroeconomic consistency. If you take the general numbers that are given out by many of the gurus in the world, there is no way in hell, A, that any advanced economies are going to give you that finance, and especially in the current context. Now that Europe has said we're going to spend 5% of their GDP on defense under Mr. Trump's pressure, there's no chance in hell of any kind of aid for climate finance coming from them. Two, even if, and this is a bigger point, that even if those things were going to possible to come to that aid, there's no way that emerging markets in developing country can absorb that kind of external finance. So you've got to do macro consistency checks. Third, something that Janak didn't talk about much is that obviously if there's a limit of how much external finance shouldn't be available that you can absorb, right, which is up to the current account deficit, and of course external finance is not just coming from climate finance, it's coming from many other things also. You have to look at the margin. That what this means is the rest has to come from domestic savings. There has been very little discussion internationally on what is the impact on domestic savings. That is, how much do we really need to increase domestic savings, and how, if we do, A, how much will it be? B, how will we do it? It's not so easy to say we want to increase domestic savings. You've got to. Again, the numbers that we get are within the realms of feasibility. And that's the important part. How will it? We have not got into it yet. We are working on that also. Fourth, I've already talked about that you could better look at the next 5 to 10 years. It becomes much easier to absorb and can actually focus on the action that you need to do. The other thing that we want to again make clear, which Janak did make clear, is that what we've sort of assumed is that taken government projections in each country on what they expect their growth to be until 2030, and within that context, how much will be the growth in energy generation, steel production, cement production, road transport changes, etc. And suppose there was no climate finance, there was no climate issue, what the investment would have been to achieve those targets. Now with climate issues coming in, that in the case of energy, you take the same energy production in 2030, but now the composition is different. You take the same steel production, but you said to do the steel production, you've got to mitigate what is already being produced, and you've got to mitigate what additionally was produced. There is a difference, as Jayant pointed out, between our methodology for energy and the other sectors. In the case of energy, we're just taking the path that is given by every country in terms of how much renewables they will do, and look at that, the numbers that you've given. In the case of steel and cement, what we are saying is that if you completely mitigate the carbon emission from existing plants and from additional plants that come, additional capacity that comes up by 2030, this is going to be the cost. So you're quite right that there is a difference in that. but the difference is not in the projections. The projection is still, in both cases, what government projects on the production, but the government has given no projection in any country on how much mitigation they want to do in the steel and cement sectors. And this is also partly why those numbers come out to be larger. So we call them, so one of the things that happens that many of the other estimates don't make clear how much would be investment required for business as usual, for SDGs, etc. How much we really talk about extra climate finance. So that's what we have tried to do. So as the numbers make clear, most estimates about 1 to 4 trillion a year. Our estimates about 250 billion a year, because we only accounting about 50% of the emissions. Assuming, which I have no idea if it's the correct assumption or not, assuming that the cost per unit of emission is the same for the other sectors which you've not covered, we have to double what we have given, right? From 250 billion to comes to that 500 billion a year. So that's so it is 500 billion rather than 1 to 4 trillion that others have given for EMDs. Of this number that we have got, 60% is China. So at present, at least, Chinese savings far exceed their investments, even though investments are very high. So although this has not been made very clear in our paper, I would say that for of this estimate of 250 billion for the 4 sectors, we have 500 billion for the total. China accounts for about 60%, and I would say that we don't need to, in terms of the availability of finance, we don't need to worry about it. Whether we'll do it on a different issue. But availability of finance is, to my mind, there's no issue as far as China is concerned. So we're only concerned about the other 40%. So that again becomes much more manageable. Now it does come out that as a percentage of GDP, the total is about 7%, 0.7% of GDP. India, on average, or some countries are lower, therefore India actually is the highest as a proportion of GDP, that is 1.3% of GDP, in terms of the marginal investment we need for climate mitigation, the way that we have calculated it. Now, why are results different? One, obviously, which everyone knows better than us in some sense, that in the last 10 years, the cost of renewable production in energy has really come down incredibly. I do have a question on that for the future, that if we do all the renewable investment in solar, wind, etc., will the cost rise up again as there's a much greater demand of all the materials globally? I have no idea, okay? But I'm just posing that it's possible that the cost will come down so much, but as those materials start becoming more and more difficult to mine, it is possible that might become more, but we have not taken account of that. In the case of steel and cement, at present, there are really no technologies available at present, even though people are working on it, other than the carbon capture and storage. And those are very expensive. And we're only assuming, you have no idea how much people are doing actually. I think what we've shown is we do have cost estimates, how much it costs, therefore given the cost of what it would if we actually do it. There's one important point here, that 10 years ago, I chaired the transport committee under Mr. Ahluwalia's direction as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. He always got others to do the dirty work, so I did that at that time. And I produced a 5-volume report. Unfortunately, I only produced it 2 months before I left, so I never read it. And there were 5 volumes in any case. But the point I'm making is that at 2014, when we produced those reports, I had no idea of the kind of technology change that has taken place and how much the costs will come down. We had absolutely no idea. And we had a whole chapter in the report in terms of transport, looking at the projection for energy requirement. We projected the requirement for coal, which was huge, obviously, for the next, up to 2032. We did for the next 20 years or thereabouts, in 2012 to 2014. And we said, look, one of the biggest investments that railways needs in transport is to transport that coal. Okay? And we're damn wrong. So that's the other reason why I feel that whereas you need to make the projections for carbon abatement mitigation by 2050, 2070, making those numbers projections for investment requirements are bound to be wrong. That's one of the other reasons why we've done up to 2030 only. The second point there is that in the case of steel and cement, the biggest requirements will be in the emerging market economies, because the advanced economies won't be growing that much at all. So the marginal requirements for steel and cement won't be much. Two, that in the case of cement, a lot of the production in the advanced economies is to electric arc furnaces, which use scrap steel scrap. And therefore, the emission is much less than ours in steel, whereas we will continue to grow in the emerging market economy. In the case of India, let us say 6 or 7% at least, hopefully higher. So we will continue to use the blast furnace because we don't have that much steel scrap because we've not been advanced for very long, we've not been developed for very long. We're still developing country. And so the point I'm making is there's very little incentive in the advanced economies to do the R&D investment for mitigation of carbon emission from steel and cement. Mostly it has to be done by India and China, if we have to do it. And this is where India and China must find ways of cooperating with each other to do that R&D investment, because we are going to be affected the most. I've already talked about the external finance, and therefore our main point is that look, these are not, obviously we have lots of assumptions, it's not easy numbers to get, that each number can be questioned. But we are confident that the kind of numbers we're given are much more realistic than others are given, and that they are within the realm of possibility, and therefore I wish we had done this a few months earlier, so maybe I could have gone to Belim and said, look, all you fellows, look at this. The world can do this, damn it. We can cope with climate change if we just make investment. What we do need to find are incentives required, particularly for steel and cement, to do the CCS even, because that's almost all of the private sector. And so you have to have incentives, government programs to make sure that this happens. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rakesh. Now, we move to the discussants. But just to, I don't intend to say anything at the end. And I just want for the audience to focus on 2 or 3 things that have come out. And I think the discussants will obviously address those. I mean, one which is clear, that these are estimates up to 2030. They're not anchored in any explicit, they may be implicit, no explicit transition to net zero. They are official estimates, whatever they are. 2, the finance that comes out of this has been estimated based on, again, official estimates. And it does seem to be lower than some of the huge numbers that have floated around. Though I must say, by the way, that I don't know what to do with this. Oh. Hang on. Doesn't work.
I'll put it on silent.
What was I going to say? Yeah. One issue is that I think a lot of these estimates, you said that they are for, yours are annual. A lot of these estimates are for 2030.
No, we have both annual
but
and
even
of course
then,
up to 20.
you come out with less, which is a little bit comforting.
No, our goes up to 20. They have given both the sum till 2030 and
the other fellows
annual.
haven't done it annually, but if you linearly project, it's clear that you come out with less, and that's in itself good. What is not very clear is, what are the trade implications of making an optimal adjustment. I mean, if in the next 5 or 6 years we're going to rely a lot on the sharp drop that has occurred in costs, is that dependent on imports or no? And are we assuming that by producing the stuff ourselves, we will be competitive during that period. Now, you can make whatever assumption you want, but that's an issue that's relevant. And the last one, of course, which you bring out clearly, is that even if you accept the lower estimates and so on, and I think the higher ones are just infeasible, the MDBs have to do a lot more. But there's a tension there between what the developing countries, including us, are saying on the source of finance and what comes out with the whole MDB stuff. We have, in the Larry Summers NK Singh report, sort of said that, look, there's a big role for the MDBs, but I think if you look at the whole COP, their focus is very much on UN sources. I mean, I don't think there's any chance of getting any money through things like the global, the climate fund, etc. But that's an issue, and maybe some of the discussants will comment on that. But now, a slight departure from what is announced. I think for Franziska, it must be middle of the night or very early in the morning.
1:35.
So we're going to have her make her comments first, and then we'll go on to Jayant and then Prodipto. So, please.
Thank you, Montek. Thank you very much. Since I can't be in the room with you, I will just show you a couple of slides.
Can we raise the volume? Or can you speak?
Since I can't.
Yeah, speak louder.
Is that better?
Yep, it's
Is
a
that
big
better?
hall.
Yeah.
Yep.
Also, Franziska, for your benefit, we've got Shekhar Iyer here. So
Yes, I heard. I heard his comment on great minds think alike. I actually had a similar comment, independently. So first, thank you very much for inviting me to this, because I do actually think this was very illuminating for me, this report. We've done our share of climate modeling, and the difference here is, Rakesh, you should have mentioned another thing that is a contribution of this report. It's very meticulously describes a simple, fundamentally a simple methodology. So it becomes something that others can easily implement, even if one doesn't have this massive macro model around it. So I really appreciated that also about your presentation and your report. I enjoyed reading it. Thank you very much. The assumptions are really well documented. You have costing of each of the technologies. It's well founded in the literature. So that really helps understand how you get to these estimates. And then, I don't need to, we've discussed. So just for those in the audience who haven't read the report, just as a benchmark, what Professor Sinha was talking about, the estimates that Janak and Rakesh come up with are about 0.5% of GDP per year for emerging markets. They have a nice table that compares other estimates. There's somewhere between 2 and 8% of GDP. So that's the order of magnitude difference that the discussion earlier was about. Now, I do have some suggestions and comments. The first two are really about the size, the magnitude of the estimates, and I kind of don't want to repeat them, because the ambition of the targets, the question about ambition of the targets was already raised by Professor Sinha. Shekhar raised the question about the sector selection. Now these sectors are selected, let me just skip right there. Currently, the way you select the 4 sectors is by their contribution to CO2 emissions. So these sectors account for about half of CO2 emissions in these 9 countries, and these 9 countries account for about 30% of global emissions. An alternative way of selecting the sectors would be what Shekhar said, would be to start with only the sectors that have the lowest abatement cost. So that would drop steel and cement. Because CCC, like you said, CCS is just about the most expensive technology you can think of in abatement. And maybe you could get lower estimates then if you started with the sectors that were much easier to abate. On the other hand, you might get higher estimates if you do what Professor Sinha says and have more ambitious targets. So that's on the magnitude of the estimates. But then beyond finance, and that picks up a bit on what Rakesh said and also what Montek said. These climate finance decisions are made in a broader context. First, that's something Rakesh has not mentioned yet. First, even if you had the climate finance, finance is only one of the obstacles to mitigation. Other obstacles are lack of regulation or lack of enforcement of regulation or lack of information. And you have, that is a whole different set of policies. So I'd be very keen to hear what Janak and Rakesh think about these other policies that would have to complement finance. Should this even be absorbed, even if you could have to finance and if it was consistent with the macroeconomic framework? And the other set of issues is, of course, the trade-offs between climate and development, because, of course, all these decisions are made in a broader context. Oh, sorry, one more thing on the previous slide, on the policies. That, of course, picks up also what Montek said about trade. So even if you have finance, even if firms are willing to implement it, they do need to have access to the technology, which is your point, Montek, on trade. Okay, then the last item here is on the trade-offs. The policy decisions, of course, weighs the cost versus the benefit. And the costs here are very nicely demonstrated in this report. The benefit is the other side of the equation, and this report is like a segue into this calculation. If you combine it with this marginal value of public funds approach that some recent papers have done, for example, that literature review by Hahn. So for example, we've done a little back of the envelope calculation just to use your estimates. A very commonly used estimate of the environmental value of abating 1 ton of carbon, CO2, is $190. The cost per ton of steel sector abatement in your India calculation is 69 in your table 45. And that suggests that the marginal value of public funds of the steel sector abatement in India is 2.8. Now, is 2.8 high or low? So what these authors consider high is actually 5, a level of 5. So 2.8 is kind of middle of the road. So that might make policymakers think, should they be doing steel sector CCS abatement of carbon CO2 emissions, or should they do something else, like completely different, not related to finance? And your estimates are really laying the groundwork for this kind of calculation. To make it easier to judge what are the priorities and what could be, what might be second order priorities. But overall, thank you very much for the study. I really enjoyed the read, and congratulations on it.
That's music to our ears.
Thank you very much, Franziska. And I don't know if you're going to stay with us or just go off and get some sleep, but you're free to do either. Jayant, can I have your comments now?
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahluwalia. And let me start by just adding my thanks to Franziska's thanks. Really, thank you to Dr. Mohan and to Dr. Raj for putting together a very interesting set of analyses. And as you can saw from just the beginnings of our discussion, it has provided a lot of provocative sparks for discussion. So let me be provocative.
Sure. That's what we want.
So first of all, I completely understand I have walked into the economist's den. So I'm the only one on this panel who's not an economist. I don't have a PhD in economics. I'm just an engineer.
But you're only one teaching in an economics institution.
Yes, but as a professor of practice, not as an academic professor. So it's really my practical experiences. So I'm not an economist, and I don't look at these problems the way an economist would look at them. I frame the problem very differently, which is why my views are actually at some level quite different from the views that Dr. Mohan and Dr. Raj have expressed. So my assessment and understanding of this problem is based on the work I've done over the last 6 or 7 years. And that perspective is very much that of an engineer and as an investor. As an engineer and as an investor. So first, as an engineer, we all understand, despite what others say, that climate change is real, the physics of it is indisputable, and that it is going to have compounding and very significant effects, particularly on South Asia. Now, I'm not going to describe what those effects are. We are all quite conversant with those. But the way we have to set up the problem and try and solve it is to recognize that what happens in this decade is extraordinarily important for our decarbonization trajectory. So while I'm a little younger than Dr. Mohan, I also don't believe that we should be talking necessarily about 2050, etc. We need to talk about this decade, the decade of the 20s. This is vitally important, and we have to bend the decarbonization curve in this decade. And there are two very important reasons for that. One, because most of the assets we are talking about here, again speaking as an investor, are long duration assets. Power plants are in the ground for 30, 40 years. You know, I was just in my constituency, Hazaribagh, where we inaugurated the 800 megawatt supercritical thermal power plant. Right now, another 1600 megawatts to come, and it's going to be a 4000 megawatt supercritical thermal power plant. How long is that going to run? 40, 50 years. So if we have to bend the curve, we know that when we talk about trucks, buses, power plants, transportation networks, we are talking about long duration assets that are going to last a very long time. So we have to start to work on those now, otherwise what we will have in 40 and 50 and 60 is going to be a very different system from what we want it to be. Point number one. Point number two, and I say this as somebody who has a degree in operations research and has spent a lot of time doing systems dynamics, not macro modeling or econometric modeling, is this massive path dependence on many of these trajectories. So you head down a certain trajectory. All of us that use QWERTY keyboards understand path dependence. So there's tremendous path dependence that we have to understand, and if we don't set the trajectory right now, this decade, we will have no chance of meeting, forget 2 degrees centigrade, even 3 degrees centigrade. As it is, the UN has already projected that we are somewhere between 2.6 to 3 degrees centigrade. That will be absolutely disastrous for South Asia. So action is required now. That's the way I have framed the problem. Now, if action is required now, should we take a macro view or should we take a view in terms of how do we finance the projects that will make a difference on the ground right now? And that's the lens that I have used. And there have been multiple studies where the methodology is very different from the methodology you followed. But let me very quickly explain the methodology and then tell you what the implications are, which in some ways are actually not that different from even the methodology you followed. So the methodology we followed is to say, okay, let's take a baseline case, a business as usual case based on current policies, government projections, what industries are doing, etc., etc. And that's kind of the business as usual baseline case. Then, and the tools we've used have largely been systems dynamics because you really can't, use econometric forecasting for 30, 40, 50 year projections. But then if you take that, and several pieces of work have been done by MIT, by the World Resources Institute, by the Asia Society, by McKinsey, which has been very bottoms up systems dynamics type work. All of them have shown that if you look at a decarbonization trajectory for India, which is all I'm going to talk about, frankly, because I haven't looked at the other countries. But if you take India and look at decarbonization trajectories for India, even for 2070, we have to be on a very different decarbonization trajectory from what the government is saying. And all that the government has right now is for the power sector. You've correctly identified that for other industrial sectors, there is no baseline case right now. But if you take the baseline case for power and then start to estimate what it will take under current course and speed, there is a very different decarbonization trajectory that ends up happening. And as I said, if these are the government's projections and we hear the net zero 2070 projections have to be much sharper in terms of decline of decarbonization. Virtually all the analyses that we've seen, and this is very physics, so it's not something that we need to worry about too much, but by the 2040s, if we still have a lot of thermal, 40, 50, 60% of our energy, by 2070 we are not going to reach net zero because of our 3.5 billion tons of carbon that we are pumping out right now. Billion tons is coming from coal-fired power plants right now. So if we don't retire coal-fired power plants by the mid-2040s, we are not going to get to net zero by 2070. So that's quite clear in terms of all the different modeling studies and just the basic math of what we're talking about. So we've developed a baseline, we've developed a net zero 2070 trajectory, and then we've assumed, given declining cost curves and all of that, what's the incremental capital expenditure that's required? And across a range of, as I said, 4 or 5 different studies, the delta, which is at the end of the day not that different from yours, shows that in the decade of the 2020s, we have to increase corporate capex by $50 to $100 billion. Now you had $54 billion. Our studies are indicating 50 at the lowest, but 100 billion, somewhere in that range of about 60, 70 billion dollars more we are going to have to spend to be on a meaningful decarbonization trajectory. So we are not that far off. But frankly, it doesn't matter whether it's 54 billion or 75 billion or 100 billion. Why do I say that? I say this as an investor. Total corporate capex in India right now, private sector corporate capex, and these sectors we're talking about right now are largely either public sector, which is counted in corporate capex, or private sector. They're not public infrastructure. Okay, this is corporate capex. Total corporate capex in India over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years has been between the range of 60 to 70 billion dollars. That's it. So even if I accept your number of 54 billion dollars, and methodologically I'm not there, I'm at a much higher number, if you will. Even if you accept $54 billion relative to $70 billion, we are going to have to increase corporate capex by 80% when in the last 5 years it's flatlined. Now, how do we put those projects on the ground when we are just not able to increase corporate capex? And to sharpen the point further, and I say this now as an investor, when we are talking about $54 billion worth of capex that's going in, we're talking about $15 billion more of equity. Where is that equity at risk capital going to come from, a $15 billion more incrementally? We just don't have those sources of at risk equity capital, particularly for this kind of infrastructure capital intensive investing. So if you're going to do things like AI, or we're going to do things that are much, much more high margin and high, sort of capital ROIC type numbers, yes, we will get some of that investment. But right now, whatever investment we're going is going into those sectors. It's not going into these capital intensive sectors. So where are we going to get that private equity or surplus being invested in these very capital intensive sectors? Sadly, right now in India, there's just a handful of business groups that are actually able to make these very large capital intensive investments. And that has its own challenges in terms of a balanced competitive economy. So the real problem, and I'll conclude here, the real problem is that unless we can find the sources of capital across our economy and at-risk equity capital, which means that people are taking risk and putting capital into the ground in these capital-intensive projects, we are not going to be able to bend the curve. And I say this as president of Eversource Capital, where we own the largest bus company, which is a purely electric bus company in India. We've just built up and sold a utility-scale solar plant. We own the second largest commercial industrial solar company, and we own the largest corporate fleet company that is running EVs right now. So I'm in the middle of this whole set of issues in terms of raising capital for these companies, raising another fund so we can get more capital to go against these kinds of decarbonization opportunities, and it is very, very difficult. And global capital, frankly, just looks at it and says, if I can put money into an AI data center in Virginia and get 18% dollar, why would I go for 15% rupee IRR? Why would I do that? No fiduciary, no pension fund, no insurance company is going to put money if you're getting 15, 18% equity IRRs in India when I can get 15, 18% dollar equity IRR in the US or in Japan or in Korea or in the EU. It's not going to happen, and it's not happening. This is the real issue that we're dealing with right now. So frankly, whether global capital is going to come in and fill in that $15 billion gap or the $54 billion gap, I think it's a theoretical question. The really practical question is, can we mobilize large pools of domestic capital so we're in control of our destiny and we can make these investments? I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayant. That was very good. Prodipto?
Thank you, Montek. And let me thank CSEP and Rakesh and Janak for very kindly inviting me to this very stimulating seminar. Now let me begin by assuring Jayant that he's not as lonely as he thinks. I mean, he may be the only non-economist in town, but there are 3 of us who are engineers. So he's in good company. So, let me begin by saying that, and this is something that the paper alludes to, is that there is a wide range of investment of estimates of investment for net zero, and they come from the fact that they adopt different methodologies, they make different assumptions, but let me correct something that, let me address something that Janak mentioned in his very first slide, where he says that model-based top-down approaches, the underlying methodology is not adequately explained. So let me begin by sort of, enumerating some of the methodologies that actually have been followed in making these estimates and which partly explain the zoo of estimates that we have for net zero. So there are three basic approaches. So first is top-down computable general equilibrium models. All economists are familiar with that or should be, and these mimic a market economy. Then we have models which combine economics and energy, and these are essentially bottom-up linear programming models, and they minimize system-wide costs of mitigation over a defined time period, and this goes to the observation that this gentleman here made. And the third is the engineering bottom-up approaches like what has been done in the present effort. Now, I think let me spend a little while enumerating the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these approaches. So first, CG models. So they have this ability to trace second or hard order effects of policy instruments. For example, you might want to have a carbon tax to implement a carbon constraint. And one thing that Janak mentioned is about, in his macroeconomic analysis that there is an appreciation of the exchange rate. Of course there is, but what happens to the economy when that happens is something that a CG model can do very, very well and very easily. The second is that CG models enable you to actually project GDP growth rates, as well as relative prices, foreign exchange rates, demand, investments in each sector. They are all endogenous to these models. Now let me come to the weaknesses, and there are many. The first is they assume competitive markets in all sectors, and when it is plain that in fact any significant modern economy has large sectors which are cartelized, which have oligopolies and so on. Second, that there is no mechanism to determine the investment shares in different sectors. So in this market-based model, we necessarily have to introduce an element of central planning. How much of the total available investment funds go into each sector? That's a huge weakness of these models. A third is the small country assumption in international trade. Now, when you're dealing with large economies, China, even India in the energy sector, and certainly the US, I mean, this assumption just flies out of the window. And another is that, in this game, there are options which are called free lunches. That is, these are negative cost options. So in CG models, you just assume that they don't exist because all firms operate on the production possibilities frontier. And of course, there is no money in the models, which is why the kind of macroeconomic, monetary analysis that Janak gave cannot be done from these models. Now let me turn to the linear programming models. First, their strengths. They use an engineer's understanding of technology, which involves much more detail than the economist's understanding of technology, which is simply one point on the production possibilities frontier. So this leads to greater precision in cost estimates, and including the fact that you're able to account for free lunches. Second, that you use micro-level estimates, micro-level demand estimates, including time of day, day of week, the appliance and vehicles usage, that's the actual usage patterns. And so this gives you much more precision in your cost estimates. Now, their weaknesses. All exogenous assumptions, GDP growth rates, sectoral demands, and so on, have to come outside. You either get them from a CG model, or you just guess at them, or you do what Janak and Rakesh have said, that you use government projections, however they have been arrived at. Then these detailed usage patterns of appliances, vehicles, capital equipment, they must have to be worked out on essentially a back of envelope approach. You can't use CG models for that. And the third, which is common to both CG as well as the linear programming models, and the linear programming models, it is actually much more the case that they are extremely data intensive. You need a detailed inventory of the stock of technologies actually employed in all sectors of the economy in the initial year, and together with their performance parameters. Now, third, let me come to the third type of approach that Janak and Rakesh have done, and that strength is in precision in working out the cost estimates. And the weakness, which has been alluded to, is that there are pure guesses as far as GDP growth and capacity requirements. And of course, what they've done is not guessed, they have used government projections. There are no changes in the relative prices in the assessment period. No feedback to the real macroeconomy. And so there is no way that you can actually trace out what is the effect of this diversion of investments to mitigation from other sectors. What will it do to GDP growth rates? What will it do to your trading patterns and so on? Now, another source of divergence that comes from these different estimates comes from the use of social discount rates. Now, I consider that social discount rates are appropriate when you're doing exercises like cost-benefit analysis, when you're comparing alternative investment profiles. They are not appropriate when you're trying to actually project investment requirements in the future. For example, if you want to invest in a 1 megawatt solar power plant in 2050, you can't use the discounted cost of that in 2025 to determine what you're going to. And so a lot of these estimates, they discount 2050, 2070 estimates in each year, and it comes at 8%, and it comes down to a very small figure, and that accounts for a lot of these smaller estimates. Now, the present study, of course, has strengths and weaknesses which are common to this particular approach. But specifically about this particular study, some observations that I would like to make are, you are assuming identical abatement technologies in each of the sectors in all 9 EMEs. Okay? Now, this is something which would be ironed out if you use the linear programming model, which chooses from the technologies available. Now, even then, I'm a little surprised that you lay so much emphasis for the cement and steel plants on CCS. The fact is that, CCS has been piloted for the last 30 or 40 years. And worldwide, there is no large-scale plant which is using CCS. There are some which are using it for enhanced oil recovery. But there is no pure CCS plant on any power or steel plant equipped with CCS, on an industrial scale anywhere in the world. So that is one aspect. The second, another point is that, you see, you have mentioned about scrap. Now, we don't generate that much scrap, but we import scrap, and we can import a lot more. And once you import a lot more, and your power sector gets gradually decarbonized, then in that case, your emissions profile of your steel sector will also come down. Similarly, with respect to the cement sector, there's a hell of a lot of biomass in this country. And then, you can use this also, you can also do this for steel plants. Steel plants use a lot of coal, but they can also use biomass. Okay, and we have something like 700 million tons of coal equivalent of crop biomass a year, 1.6 1.6 billion tons of animal waste a year, which left to itself would be generating methane, which just goes up in the sky. So animal waste is actually considered a negative emissions option. So you have not used all these possible options. So I would suggest that if you do a round two, look at some more technologies which are appropriate to each of the countries. So finally, let me, which since nobody has talked of it, let me turn to something of the politics of climate change, of the climate change negotiations, which I've been following since 2001. The fact of the matter is that the original assumption, particularly of Europe and Japan, was that they hold the mitigation technologies. They would sell these technologies to large emerging countries which were on their, which were on a growth path, and then they would capture these markets, and they would do it by trying to impose top-down carbon constraints on them. Now, in a sense, China has beat them at their own game. We may not like that, but the facts stare us in the face that the Chinese have gone so far ahead in terms of almost all the mitigation technologies, whether you're talking of course, for power, for steel, for vehicles, that I think at this point there is a pause, certainly there's a pause in the US, that there is little point in trying to catch up with the Chinese at this game. And so therefore you have statements like from Bill Gates, where he is now veering around to something that has been the traditional Indian position, that yes, climate change is important. It is one of among many serious development issues, and we had better put our money where we can get the best development impact. Now, if that story is correct, then I would be very pessimistic about any significant funds coming from the NDBs or even the global financial markets. And this is apart from the reasons that Jayant has given as to why should an investor, have 15% rupee returns when he can get 18% dollar returns. That's all I have to say. Thank you, Montek.
Thank you very much, Prodipto. Now, we've got very limited time, but I just want a show of hands because I don't want the audience to lose out. How many people want to ask questions? 1, 2. That's it? Just three, 4. Let's take these 4 and maybe would you like to have those questions before you respond?
Yeah,
and you can
much
respond.
better, much better.
You can't really respond.
Much better.
So, okay, can we have the mic?
Rakesh, first of all, excellent panel. Thank you very much. I just want to ask about, what is the trajectory of so we've got costs falling at an exponential rate, whatever they're following, Goldman's law, Moore's law, whatever. Is there not an advantage to waiting before you invest in abatement technology because tomorrow costs will be cheaper than they are today? On the other hand, the reason that these exponential laws work is because of learning by doing and the fact that costs are coming down because the scale is going up. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there, and I wonder how you deal with it in your particular study and any general comments on that.
Okay. Yeah, maybe back and then here.
Yeah. My basic question is that we are finding that as far as Indian manufacturing sector is concerned, it is a lot more capital intensive. It does not, I mean, for example, manufactured through latest technologies for like nanomaterials, super alloys, composites, etc., which are used in latest, electric vehicles, etc., battery technologies, etc. And we are also importing a lot of capital goods also. So basically, that means that we are basically a lot more, working on legacy technologies, which are like regular steel or for that matter cement, etc., which is a lot more carbon intensive and basically does not have a very good prospects as far as future is concerned. So why can't we change our manufacturing standards to some of these innovative solutions?
Fair enough. Thanks. Third question here.
Dr. Janak, in your estimation, you stated that you're not including the cost of integration RE. Now that's actually a very significant cost. What has happened is the power sector has changed. Earlier, there was energy was expensive, but reliability came at almost no additional cost. And we are now moving into an environment where the cost of energy is low, but the cost of reliability is much higher. So when you ignore the cost of reliability, you may be underestimating the cost for transitioning in the power sector.
Thank you. Well, let me now ask the authors to respond. But maybe as chairman of the moderating group, I can add one question. I'm a bit surprised that nobody has asked the question of a carbon tax. So I just want to ask them that in all this strategizing, I mean, doesn't it follow if things are that bad, if things are that serious, if we have to do something and we want to attract private capital, should we or should we not seriously push for a carbon tax? Because there seems to be no willingness, at least in the political area, to even think that's feasible. But whether it's feasible or not, as economists, do they think it's a good idea? That's my question. All for you, gentlemen.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just briefly touch upon some of the questions which have been raised.
Touch on whatever you like, but not all the questions. You can't do that.
Yeah. So, no, Franziska made a suggestion that we should compare, there is a trade-off and we should compare a marginal value of public funds with the social cost. It's a very good idea, but it will be very difficult. But let's try. I think it's worth doing, though it will be very challenging. But let's see how we proceed with that. Now, the point which Jayant made, sir, let me point out another study which we are doing. We have taken into account to raise where the funds will come from. We are estimating, if there are different stages, different degrees of revival of private capex cycle. It has been in doldrums for the last several years. So we have made saving estimates, and fortunately, what we are finding that financial liabilities in the household sector are expected to come down, as a result of which net financial savings in the household sector are likely to increase. So we find that if you take into account the revival of different degrees of revival of private capex cycle, perhaps it may not be much of a challenge for us to finance the climate action, what we have estimated.
No, that's a theoretical analysis. There are trillions of dollars of capital on the planet, so everything can be financed.
Yeah.
Its returns is the issue, not capital.
There is a surcharge on coal levied by government of India. So you can call it carbon tax or surcharge on coal. What difference does it make?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and the point which you made about the CCS, I agree with you that CCS is not widely used. Only of the total carbon emissions, CCS is used only 0.1% of to capture the total carbon emissions. But it's also a fact that there is no other technology which can address the carbon emissions coming from the cement and steel sector. And the other technology which I mentioned, direct air capture, that captures only 0.01, and that's still at the stage of infancy. And energy efficiency and renewables can help us address the carbon emission of cement and steel sector only to some extent, only energy related, but insofar as process related, because the way the cement and steel is produced, it's highly carbon intensive. So that process related carbon emissions from these two sectors cannot be managed through any other technology other than the CCS. But I agree that the use of that as of now is not that much. The point which he raised, Daljit, about the integration cost. See, if we were to take the integration cost, we had to build many scenarios, which was not possible for us to. But we are now, not us, but our team in the power sector has taken up that study. Maybe when we make the next estimate, we should be able to take into account the integration cost also. Somebody raised the question of whether we have taken the existing cost or costs which are changing. We have taken the all existing cost, but only the case of battery storage. IEA had come out with an estimate that the battery storage cost will continue to decline up to 2030. So every year they said it will come down. So we have taken into account that decreasing cost for battery storage every year. But for all other things, for all other estimates, we have taken only the cost as it is prevalent now. Yeah, I'll stop here. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Just very quick responses. One take on the trade implications, because most of the stuff is being produced in China. Two answers. One, that this is for the 9 economies as a whole, not just us, that is India. So your point is very well taken as far as India is concerned. But I think it does imply that we've got to be more open to that. Whether we do it or not is a different issue, but we are taking the lowest cost at present, which is China, and yes, it will mean you have to import more from China. And there's no reason why you shouldn't do that, as far as I'm concerned. Franziska, one point which she made was on trade-offs between development and climate mitigation. Actually, we are not doing that trade-off, because we are taking as business as usual what countries are saying they would be investing anyway for all sectors, which would include infrastructure, human development, whatever it is. They may be low or high, I don't know, but we are taking what would happen anyways. We are not doing any trade-off. We're just doing what is the incremental cost. Yes, there would be a trade-off in saying, look, maybe you should, that if you're not, say in India, say you're not investing enough in health and education, the question is, should we be doing this incremental investment in that? Yes, that's a good question. And I think that we've not addressed that. I must say I was quite encouraged by Franziska's that social cost over mitigation cost ratio was very favorable, and therefore I think that more can be done. Jayant, actually, as Prodipto said, I think 3 of us have engineering backgrounds. I'm amazed that he remembers that I have an engineering background, since my first degree was in electrical engineering. These 2 don't.
Mm-hmm. So I counted only 3.
Yeah, that's 1, 2, 3. That's it. I'm amazed. I'm saying I'm amazed you remember that I have an engineering background.
If somebody is an engineer, I don't forget that. I mean.
And also, that my PhD dissertation in 1976 was one of the early CGE models. Except that I've always been small-minded, so mine was a 3-sector CGE model, as opposed to 100 sectors and so on. But nonetheless, your points are well taken on the different modeling that you explained. We've clearly not done that. We've chosen, in some sense, a simpler approach. One point you made on the, on the CCS cost being very high, no one's using, that's quite right. Now, if there are other technologies available, right, that will make the cost even lower. So if we can get some estimates of those, that'd be interesting to do. And so, in fact, our point will become even stronger. Okay, if we are taking the very high cost of CCS for steel and cement, if there are other things that become available, that's why I did say that just like there's been the huge cost reduction in the last 10 years, which no one expected 10 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jayant. Maybe you expected it, so maybe you've been a good investor and made a lot of money on knowing that this is going to happen. But Yes, that's a very important point. That's why I said, look, this is why it's really necessary, particularly China and India, to get together to work on these particular costs, because no one else is going to do it. And I think that's a big important message that we have. On path dependence, 100%. I think that's a very good point. What we ought to look at is that take some of the paths, say 2050, 2070, bring that down to 2030 or 35, and what's the implication for our projection? I think that's a terrific idea. Second, on the financing, again, you're right. So you've now volunteered yourself to help us in our next study. Because it's exactly what we are doing. That is, where will this financing come from in terms of public sector, private sector, domestic, foreign, equity, debt, and which parts come from? So you just nominated yourself, and of course we will not pay you for that. What you could do
where are my returns on that? Right?
What you could do is to invest in us to do this study, and you get your returns.
This is proving to be a very expensive panel.
But seriously, I think that is exactly what we'd like to do, and I think that the kind of insights that you have as a working in the sector, in terms of actually investing, looking at technology, etc., will be very, very, very useful for us. Yeah. Some of the other questions, the cost coming down. Again, as we said, that we've only taken what information is available today, but again, it is suggesting that there could be some cost going up. The general likelihood would be that if we go on this path, that there would be enough activity to bring costs down. And so it's become even more feasible that we can conquer the climate change problem. The cost of integration, Janak has already answered you, Daljit. Yes, that's absolutely right. And I gave some of this, what we've done in a very brief presentation to the McKinsey Global Institute, and this was the big point that was made there actually, is the high cost, because just to explain what Daljit was saying, you see, in the fossil fuel based power or hydro, etc., the supply is very stable. What is not stable is the demand side, that is both time of day as well as season, which is what also Prodipto was talking about. So the grid only has to balance on the demand side because the supply is stable. What's going to happen now with the renewable, as the renewable weight goes up, then the supply is also unstable in the sense of both time of day, solar in the day, etc., and also in terms of seasons. So the grid management will be that much more difficult because you're balancing both variations, both within the day and across seasons, in terms of the grid management. So yes, we don't have those costs, and yes, they will be significant.
There's a role of price in that.
Yeah, of course. No, obviously.
What I mean is completely missing.
No, some coming.
You need to emphasize that.
Yours was the last comment, sir.
Okay.
So I've got Montek here. Montek price.
Yeah, okay.
So that is in fact is the last point, which is that what we have not done at all, right, is to do these things. What are the policies required? What are the sources of finance? Where will the source of finance come from? We've just done the cost estimation given this kind of information. That obviously is the next step. So, for example, let's say carbon tax. It has both implication of getting resources, also impact in terms of carbon tax, what it will do to polluting activities. So yes, we have not done that. And that is something that we ought to do in the next step. When we look at what are the, as I mentioned, that we do need to look at policies that will incentivize the private sector, most of this in the private sector, to do what you would like them to do. Whether it's in terms of subsidies of some kind, which could come from the carbon tax in terms of revenue, or in terms of putting carbon tax which reduce their activities in terms of pollution, etc. So yes, I think that's very important. But yes, so in terms of our next kinds of phases of work, one, we need to seriously look at the sources of financing, which means both macro and less macro. macro in the sense of overall savings and investments, where it's going to come from. Less macro in the sense of, as I said, debt, equity, private sector, public sector, foreign, domestic. So all these things, it is not very easy to do. But we are hoping to do that. And 3 other policies in terms of incentives on how this can be done. Thank you, Montek.
Thanks a lot. Thank you all for coming.
Just one. No. You said the cost and the weight. 2 major points which have come in the recent part. One is the cost of green hydrogen, which is not economically viable now, and many say that it may not be viable even up to 2030 or even beyond. And another is the cost of carbon capture and storage. That cost also we are not aware whether it will come down by 2030 or so. The question is, there will be trade-off. If you really want to make a big, dent on the carbon emissions, we want to reduce it, then the question is then how long we'll wait. So there will be trade-off. You will have more resources, technology could be cheaper going forward, but then the carbon emission would also be huge.
So just one other thing, all the people, colleagues who worked with us, please stand up.
Indramani, Ashi, and also that Amshika Amar is there. Amshika.
Amshika has defected to Terry with Prodipto.
Okay.
So we don't recognize her.
Thank you for that.
Okay. Well, let me just close on one note, because I noticed that at least there was one person in the audience supporting the idea of a carbon tax, providing it's called a surcharge. That doesn't matter. But just put a number down. I mean, I think Franziska raised this issue, the ratio of cost and benefit. That's very much relevant to what they think is an appropriate carbon tax, although she said that developing countries may not accept that high. But roughly they're talking about carbon taxes in the range of maybe $120 per ton of CO2. And some of the work that Utkarsh has been doing says that if you really take it to 270, that carbon tax would be much higher, okay? So, I mean, in thinking of the price implication of all these changes, you're really talking of raising a tax which currently amounts to about $3 per ton as quickly as possible to something in the range of $100 per ton. Now, I mean, rationally, if you were to do that, 90% of the rest of the incentives to make the change would occur anyway. If you don't do that, some joint secretary somewhere will have to be specifying, you must do this, you must do the other, and quite honestly, it will be an unbelievable mess. I'm not saying that we can get to $100, but I think it's absolutely vital that we create an awareness that if the required rate is approximately $100, and certainly it will be $200 by the time we reach Viksit Bharat, we better make a start now. I mean, if you had a 10-year program to raise the carbon tax to something reasonable, somebody should sketch out what that would be. I mean, unless people are made aware of it, and particularly, by the way, NGOs. The biggest supporters of all this controlling climate change are NGOs. They're also the biggest opposers of any form of carbon taxation. Because the view is we must have energy and it must be affordable. I mean, that's basically cancelling out one to the other.
Actually, Rajesh Chadha has done through a CGE model. Rajesh Chadha has, through a CGE model, done an estimate of what the carbon tax will.
Well, you want to speak up? Just tell us what it should be.
No, not what the impacts actually.
Yeah, tell us.
Yeah, what we have done
stand up.
Using a social accounting matrix, not CGE.
Not CGE, sorry, yeah.
So we'll be working on CGE. So what we have estimated is that if the consumption losses to some of the lower middle classes are, so we have compensated them with 50% and 50% has gone to technology upgradation, and we have taken 2 estimates. One is around $30, other, if I remember, is around $50 a ton. So that paper is available as a discussion, a technical paper on the CSEP website.
Well, now you will read it.
Montek,
Technical paper is very good, but no harm in having it on Instagram, because nobody reads technical papers.
I don't look at Instagram.
Yeah. This must be in somebody's mind, कि भाई ये करना है नहीं तो कुछ नहीं होगा.
Yeah,
I think that's the important point.
Prodipto, I only read technical papers, never Instagram.
So I have been involved in a number of studies coordinated by the ISA.
By whom? ISA.
Okay, in which what they've done is that, collaborating institutions, they've got this, huge global CG model and a number of national CG models embedded in that, and the ISA, dominated as it is by economists like you, say that, look, let's move to efficiency and have a uniform carbon price across all countries. So that you have a carbon tax, that's a uniform carbon price across all countries.
Yeah.
Okay. Then the question is that the proceeds, how do you share them? And that goes to the question of equity, and this is the Achilles heel of the global club politics of climate change.
Yeah, it's a big problem. But anyway, thank you all, and thanks to the two paper writers for having stimulated such a lot of discussion. Congratulations both. Okay, bye-bye.